I know who you are, Mr. Bennet. The voice was soft, almost too soft, but it carried with it a weight that stopped him mid-motion. Richard Bennet froze, his hand hovering over the papers on the desk. The room, bright and imposing with its marble floors and gold-trimmed curtains, suddenly felt colder. He looked up, his gaze flicking over the young girl standing in the doorway. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was the maid's daughter, barely 12, and yet, her eyes held something that made his breath catch. I know who you are, she repeated, her tone steady and unwavering. Richard's face shifted. The room was filled with the sound of his heartbeat, loud and insistent. He had seen many faces, many people, but there was something about this one, something about Lily Dawson, that made him uneasy. Excuse me, he asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and irritation. The girl didn't flinch. She stood there, her blonde hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders, her expression set with quiet determination. The boy you lost. He lived with me in the orphanage. His name is Oliver. He's your son. The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, images of a past he had buried long ago rushing to the surface. Oliver. The boy he had lost when he was just a child. The boy he had been told was dead. The boy whose face he had never forgotten, but whose presence had been erased from his life as if it had never existed. He stood there, speechless. His eyes darted toward the papers on the desk, the financial projections, the contracts, the endless promises of growth and success. But they all blurred in his vision as the weight of Lily's words sank in. Oliver had been alive. All these years, he had been alive. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. Richard tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He opened his mouth, but nothing emerged. His eyes flicked to Lily's face again, her calm expression betraying nothing. How could she know this? How could she, a mere child from a poor family, know something so profound, something that had eluded him for so long? Lily took a step forward, her voice barely a whisper now. I saw him every day. We were together in the orphanage. We played together. He's alive, Mr. Bennet, and he's been waiting for you. Richard's legs felt weak beneath him. The weight of his empire, his success, the wealth he had amassed over the years, suddenly felt hollow. What was the point of all of it if he had lost his son and never even knew? He could feel his world crumbling, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. The truth had always been there, hidden in plain sight, and yet he had never seen it. He had never allowed himself to. The room grew colder still, the sound of Lily's voice echoing in his ears, and for the first time in years, Richard Bennet felt truly lost. I know who you are, Richard Bennet, Lily repeated, her voice low but unwavering. Richard's heart skipped a beat as the words sank in. His thoughts were racing, but his body felt frozen, unable to react. He had never expected something like this. For years, he had lived with the painful knowledge that he had lost his son, only to have that truth torn apart by the words of this young girl. He stared at Lily, searching her face for some sign of a lie, but there was none. Her expression was calm, almost too calm for someone so young, but there was a depth to her eyes that belied her age. She wasn't lying. I know you don't remember, but I remember Oliver. He was your son, Mr. Bennet, Lily said, her voice growing softer, yet still carrying an undeniable strength. Richard's mind was still processing the shock of her revelation, but his heart had already begun to pound with a mix of confusion, fear, and regret. Oliver, he whispered, the name slipping from his lips like a memory he had long buried. It had been so long since he had heard that name. The boy he had thought was gone, lost to the world, was alive. The realization hit him like a freight train, overwhelming him with emotions he had long pushed aside. How? How do you know this? Richard finally managed to choke out, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily took a deep breath, glancing down at her hands for a moment before speaking again. I grew up with him in the orphanage. We were friends. He told me about you, about how you were looking for him, how you had given up hope. She paused, her voice trembling slightly. He never forgot you, Mr. Bennet. He always hoped that one day you'd find him, but he never knew you were looking. Richard's breath caught in his throat as Lily's words sank in. He had given up hope. He had convinced himself that Oliver was gone, that he would never see his son again. But here, in front of him, stood the truth, standing in the form of this young girl. The weight of the past 20 years came crashing down on him. He had missed everything. He had missed the chance to be a father to his son. He had let his empire, his work, consume him to the point that he had forgotten what truly mattered. "I never knew," Richard whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never knew he was still alive. All these years, I thought I had lost him forever." Lily's eyes softened as she took a step closer. "He's not lost, Mr. Bennett. He's waiting for you. He always has been." Richard's mind was reeling, but there was a part of him that felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was fragile, like a small flame in the dark, but it was there. He had a chance to make things right. "Where is he? Where is Oliver?" Richard asked, his voice desperate. Lily looked at him, her eyes full of determination. "He's living in a small town, far away from here. He's waiting for you to come. To find him." Richard's heart raced as he realized the magnitude of what lay ahead. He had spent so many years building his empire, but now, standing before this girl, he realized that everything he had worked for meant nothing compared to the chance to be a father to his son. He stood up from his chair, his resolve firm. "I'm going to find him. I'm going to bring him home." Lily smiled, a small, knowing smile. "He'll be waiting for you." As Richard turned to leave, his heart was heavy with the weight of the past, but there was also a sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he had a direction, and it led to Oliver. "I can't believe it. After all these years, I'm finally going to find him," Richard whispered to himself as he stared out the window of his office. The skyline of the city stretched out before him, a constant reminder of the empire he had built. Yet, at that moment, it all felt distant, irrelevant. His thoughts were consumed by the one thing that had eluded him for so long: his son, Oliver. He had been so focused on building his wealth, his influence, his legacy, that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. Now, standing in this moment, he felt like a man waking up from a long, empty dream. He had failed his son, but maybe, just maybe, he could still make it right. He immediately began making arrangements. The private jet, the team of security guards, the endless phone calls, all became a blur as Richard prepared for the journey ahead. He didn't need any of it. He needed only one thing: Oliver. He wasn't sure what he would find when he reached that small town. Would his son be the same? Or had the years apart changed him too much? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he couldn't back out now. He had to know. He had to find him. The journey felt like an eternity. Richard sat in the back of the plane, looking out the window as the clouds parted below them. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he was determined. He wasn't going to make the same mistake again. He wasn't going to leave his son behind. Not this time. Hours later, the plane landed in a small, quiet airport. The town was just as remote as Lily had described, nestled in the countryside far from the bustling city where Richard had spent most of his life. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just any trip. This was the trip that could change everything. He stepped out of the jet, taking in the fresh air, the earthy scent of the fields around him. It was so different from the sterile, artificial environment of his offices, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. Richard drove through the winding roads of the small town, his heart pounding with each mile. He didn't know where to start looking, but Lily's words were clear: Oliver was waiting for him. The uncertainty of what lay ahead didn't stop him. If anything, it pushed him forward. He had to find Oliver, even if it meant searching every corner of this town. As Richard entered the town's main street, he saw a small cafe. The sign above the door read, "Cozy Corner Cafe," and it seemed to be a popular spot for locals. He decided to start there. Inside, the cafe was warm, with the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filling the air. Richard approached the counter, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of his son. "Can I help you, sir?" the barista asked, looking up from her station. Richard hesitated for a moment, unsure how to ask the question that had been burning inside him. "I'm looking for a boy named Oliver. I was told he lives around here. Do you know him?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The barista paused for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Oliver? Yeah, I know him. He's a good kid. He works at the hardware store down the street. I think he's there right now." Richard's heart raced as he thanked the barista and hurried out of the cafe. He could feel his palms sweating as he walked down the street, his eyes scanning every face he passed. Was Oliver still the same boy from the orphanage? Would he even recognize his father? Richard had no answers, but he couldn't turn back now. As he reached the hardware store, Richard took a deep breath. The door chimed as he entered, and he saw a young man stocking shelves in the back. His heart skipped a beat. There, standing in front of him, was Oliver. He looked older, of course, but there was no mistaking that face. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he stepped forward, unsure of what to say. Oliver turned around, and for a moment, their eyes met. It was like time had stopped. Oliver's expression shifted from confusion to recognition. And then, slowly, he walked toward Richard, his eyes filled with disbelief. "Dad," Oliver whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Richard couldn't speak. He was too overwhelmed with emotion to form any words. Instead, he reached out and pulled Oliver into a tight embrace. The years of separation, the pain, the uncertainty, all of it melted away in that moment. "I'm so sorry," Richard finally managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "I've missed so much. I should have found you sooner." Oliver pulled back slightly, looking up at him with tears in his eyes. "I've been waiting for you." "I can't believe this is happening," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible as he looked at Oliver. The son he had thought was lost forever. The hardware store was quiet, save for the distant sound of cars driving past. It was a far cry from the hustle and bustle of Richard's life in the city, but in that moment, it felt like the perfect place. Just the two of them. "You don't have to say anything," Richard continued, his throat tight. "I know I've made 1,000 mistakes, and I can never make up for the time we've lost." Oliver stood there, still looking at him with a mixture of surprise, confusion, and something else, something Richard couldn't quite place. "I've waited so long for this moment," Oliver said quietly, his voice breaking slightly. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever see you again." Richard's heart ached at the words. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it on Oliver's shoulder. "I'm here now, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." There was a long silence between them. Oliver looked down at his shoes for a moment, his fingers running along the edge of a nearby shelf, before he met Richard's gaze again. "I don't know if we can just pick up where we left off," Oliver said, his voice uncertain. "It's been so long, and everything is different now. I don't know if I'm ready to just forgive you." Richard nodded slowly, understanding the weight of his son's words. He had no right to expect forgiveness. He had no right to expect anything from Oliver. He had abandoned him, and there was no way to take that back. But he could try to be a father now. He could try to make up for everything he had missed. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," Richard said softly. "But I want you to know that I'm here now, and I'll never leave you again." Oliver seemed to consider his words for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Then, slowly he nodded. "I want to believe you," he said quietly. "I really do. But it's going to take time." Richard's heart swelled with a mixture of hope and guilt. He had so much to make up for, so much to prove. But for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. The possibility of redemption. "Time is all we have," Richard said with a soft smile. "And I'm willing to spend all of it making things right." Oliver looked at him for a moment, and then, with a hesitant but sincere smile, he nodded. "All right, let's take it one step at a time." Richard felt the weight of the past begin to lift, even if just a little. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. But this was a start he had never thought he would get. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Bennett felt like he had a chance to be the father his son deserved. Richard sat across from Oliver in the small diner, the soft hum of the old jukebox in the corner creating a sense of calm. The clinking of cutlery and the murmur of other patrons filled the space, but Richard couldn't shake the quiet between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, not exactly, but it was new. The silence felt different now, like they were both still learning how to be around each other. He studied Oliver, noting the small changes in him over the years. He wasn't the scared little boy from the orphanage anymore. He was a young man now, a young man who had survived without a father, without anyone. Richard's heart tightened at the thought. "You've grown up so much," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. Oliver looked up, meeting his gaze. His eyes were still those bright, piercing eyes that Richard remembered, but there was a heaviness in them now. "I had to," Oliver replied quietly. "I didn't have much choice." The words hung in the air between them. Richard felt the weight of everything he had missed. "I know I can't take back the years, Oliver," Richard said, his voice raw. "But I want to make it right. I want to be here for you now." Oliver shifted in his seat, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his napkin. "I don't know if it's that easy," Oliver murmured. You don't just come back into someone's life after so long, and everything's fine. Richard nodded, understanding. I don't expect things to be fine right away. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Oliver. I'm asking for a chance. A chance to be the father I should have been. There was a long pause, and Richard could feel the weight of Oliver's gaze on him. Why now? Oliver finally asked, his voice quieter. Why after all these years? Why did you come back? Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. He looked out the window, the world outside moving on without him, without them. I've spent so many years building my empire, Richard said slowly. And somewhere along the way, I lost sight of the things that really mattered. I thought I could fix everything with money, with power. But I was wrong. It was never about any of that. It's about family. And now that I've found you again, I'm not going to let you go. Oliver's expression softened, but there was still a wall between them, a wall built from years of separation, neglect, and pain. Richard could see it in his eyes, the hesitance, the uncertainty. But there was something else there too, something that Richard clung to, hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. I'm not asking for a miracle, Richard continued. But I want to try. I want to be there for you, in whatever way you need. Even if it takes time, I'll be patient. I'll be here. Oliver didn't say anything for a moment, his fingers still fidgeting with the napkin. Finally, he looked up, his expression more open than before. I don't know what it'll look like, but maybe we can try, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard's heart swelled with relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start he thought he would never get. Thank you, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for giving me this chance. They sat there for a few moments, the silence not so heavy anymore. It was a new silence, one filled with possibility. The future wasn't clear, but for the first time in a long time, Richard felt like he had a chance to make it right, to rebuild what he had lost. And maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be too late. Richard stood in the small, dimly lit room, his hands resting on the back of the chair where Oliver sat. The room was simple, not much different from the small apartments Richard had visited during his years of building his company. But there was something about this place, this quiet, unassuming space, that felt more like home than the grand, luxurious houses he had grown accustomed to. Oliver was flipping through a photo album, his fingers brushing over the pictures of a childhood Richard had never shared with him. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with understanding, the kind of silence that comes after the hardest conversations, after the walls have come down. You never had to do this alone. Richard finally spoke, his voice low but steady. I should have been there. I should have found you sooner. Oliver didn't look up immediately. He kept his eyes fixed on the pages, his brow furrowed in thought. It wasn't about being alone, Oliver said quietly. I had people who cared about me. I learned to take care of myself. But it was different without you. Richard's heart ached at his words. He had been so focused on building an empire, on creating a legacy that would last forever. But he had forgotten the most important thing, the people he loved. I wish I could change all that, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. I can't take back the years I missed, but I want to make sure we don't lose any more time. Oliver finally looked up, his eyes meeting Richard's. There was still a hint of skepticism there, but there was something else too, a flicker of hope. It's going to take time, Oliver said slowly. I don't know if I can just forget everything. It's not that easy. Richard nodded, understanding the weight of his son's words. He didn't expect things to be easy. He didn't expect forgiveness to come quickly, but he was willing to wait. He was willing to do whatever it took to prove that he wasn't going anywhere. I know, Richard said softly. I don't want you to forget. I just want to be here, to help however I can. I want to be the father I should have been. The room was quiet again, but this time, it wasn't the same kind of silence. It was the kind of silence that came after a promise, after something real was said. Oliver's gaze softened, and for a moment, Richard saw the boy he had lost. He wasn't just the young man in front of him now. He was the little boy who had needed him all those years ago. I'm not saying it's going to be perfect, Oliver said, his voice quieter now. But maybe we can try. Maybe we can start over. Richard felt a wave of emotion rush through him. This wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. That's all I ask for, Richard said, his voice thick. A chance. And I'll be here, no matter how long it takes. Oliver smiled faintly, a small but genuine smile. I think I can live with that, he said. Richard nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. This was just the beginning. And while he didn't know what the future held, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let go of his son again. Not now. Not ever. I've never seen you so focused before, Oliver said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Richard glanced up from the pile of paperwork that seemed to fill every corner of the small office they had taken over for the day. His mind was still racing, still trying to wrap around the enormity of what he had to do. The weight of the decisions, the responsibility of being a father again, felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed, more important than any business deal he had ever made. I have a lot to make up for, Richard replied, his voice quiet but firm. He pushed the papers aside, focusing on Oliver, who was sitting across from him, watching with a mix of curiosity and concern. I've spent so many years thinking I could fix everything with money, with success. But nothing matters more than this. Then you. Oliver shifted in his seat, his eyes softening just a little. The tension between them was still there, but it wasn't as thick as before. I don't need you to fix everything, Oliver said slowly. I just need you to be here. I need to know you're not going anywhere again. Richard nodded, feeling the knot in his chest loosen. He had already made so many mistakes, but in that moment, he knew that the only thing he could do now was to show up. And he would. He would be there for his son, no matter what it took. I'm here, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm not going anywhere. Not ever again. The room fell quiet again, but this time it wasn't filled with doubt or regret. It was filled with something else, something Richard hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for a future he never thought he would have. A future where he was no longer alone. He reached across the table and placed his hand on Oliver's, a simple gesture, but one that meant more than words ever could. Oliver looked at his hand, then back at Richard. There was still a hesitation there, but it was fading. I don't know what this is going to look like, Oliver said quietly, but I'm willing to try. If you are. Richard felt his heart swell with a mixture of relief and gratitude. I'm ready. I've always been ready. I just didn't know how to start. Oliver gave him a small, hesitant smile. Well, now we know. One step at a time. Richard smiled back, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be moments of doubt, moments of struggle, but for the first time in years, Richard felt like he was on the right path. He had his son back, and he wasn't going to let go. Not this time. One step at a time, Richard repeated, his voice steady. And for the first time, he truly believed it. Richard and Oliver sat in silence, the weight of the past few weeks settling over them like a heavy blanket. Richard had moved into a small apartment nearby, his first step toward rebuilding his relationship with Oliver. They had started slowly, dinner together, quiet conversations, awkward moments, but they were trying. And that was enough for now. Oliver had started to trust him again, even if just a little. It was progress. How's work going? Richard asked, breaking the silence. Oliver glanced at him, his expression guarded, but there was a hint of openness in his eyes. It's fine, he replied. Just taking things one day at a time. Richard nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. He could see it in Oliver's eyes, the weight of the past, the uncertainty of the future. I get that, Richard said softly. I'm not in a rush, Oliver. We don't have to figure everything out all at once. Oliver looked at him, his gaze steady. I know. It's just hard, you know? After everything, it feels like things should be easier, but they're not. Richard exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. Life isn't easy, and I've made it harder than it ever needed to be. But I'm here now. I'm going to make sure you're not alone in this. Oliver remained silent for a moment, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. Richard could feel the tension between them, but it was different now. It was the kind of tension that came from two people trying to rebuild something, not from a rift that couldn't be fixed. I know, Oliver said quietly. I can feel that. It's going to take time. Richard smiled softly, a sense of warmth spreading through him. I'm willing to wait, he said. I've waited this long. A little longer won't hurt. Oliver nodded, his lips tugging into a small, tentative smile. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of hope. Hope that things could change, that they could find their way back to each other, even if it wasn't going to be quick or easy. It would take time, but they had time now. They had time to rebuild. Thanks, Dad, Oliver said quietly, the words coming out more naturally than Richard had expected. He swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "I'm just happy to be here," Richard replied. "With you." And for the first time in a long time, Richard Bennett felt like he had finally found his place in the world, not at the top of a corporate ladder, but at the side of the sun he had nearly lost forever. Richard stood at the window of his apartment, watching the city lights flicker below. The skyline was a familiar sight, but it felt different now. It no longer represented ambition or success. It didn't hold the same allure as it once did. Now, the lights seemed distant, like a world that no longer mattered as much as the one in front of him. He turned around, looking at Oliver, who was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. It had been a few months since they'd started this journey together. Things weren't perfect, but they were better. They were trying. And that was all Richard could ask for. "You doing okay?" Richard asked, his voice gentle. Oliver didn't look up at first. There was a hesitation, a moment where he seemed lost in his own thoughts. Finally, he glanced up, meeting his father's eyes. "Yeah," Oliver said, his voice quieter than usual. "I'm just thinking. A lot has changed, you know." Richard nodded, understanding the weight of his son's words. "I know," he said softly. "It's a lot to process, but we'll get through it. One day at a time." Oliver looked down at his phone again, his fingers tapping lightly on the screen. Richard could sense the underlying tension, the unspoken worries that lingered just below the surface. "You know, I never really thought about what it would be like to have a family," Oliver said, his voice almost inaudible now. "I thought it was just something people did. I never thought it was something I could have." Richard's heart ached at the words. He had been so focused on trying to fix things, trying to make up for lost time, that he hadn't truly considered how all of this might feel for Oliver. "I get that," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent so many years trying to build a life that I thought would make everything better. But now, all I want is to be here for you. Whatever that looks like." Oliver gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if considering his father's words. For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, the weight of everything they had been through settling in the room around them. Richard could feel the walls closing in, but they weren't the same walls that had once divided them. These walls were different, ones that they would break down together over time. "I'm glad you're here," Oliver said finally, his voice soft. "It's not easy, but it's better than being alone." Richard felt his chest tighten. "I'm never leaving again," he said, his voice firm. "Not now? Not ever." There was a long pause, and for the first time in a long time, Richard allowed himself to believe it. They were on the right path. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let go of his son again. Not now. Not ever. Richard sat quietly in the small park just outside Oliver's apartment, watching the world go by. It had been a few months since they had truly started their new life together, and while things were still fragile, they were improving. Oliver was slowly opening up more, and Richard was learning to navigate the delicate dance of being a father after all these years. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the park, and Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over him. This was where he was supposed to be, not in the corner office of a skyscraper, not surrounded by luxury and power, but here, with Oliver, in the quiet moments that truly mattered. He heard footsteps approaching, and when he looked up, he saw Oliver walking toward him, his hands in his pockets and a thoughtful look on his face. "You're out here early," Richard said with a smile. "I thought I'd get some fresh air," Oliver replied, sitting down beside his father on the bench. There was a pause, and then Oliver spoke again, his voice a little softer than usual. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About everything. About us." Richard turned his body slightly to face him, sensing that this was one of those moments when Oliver might say something important. "What about us?" Richard asked gently, his heart beating a little faster. Oliver shrugged, looking out at the park. "I don't know. I guess. I'm still figuring things out. It's not easy to just let go of everything that's happened." Richard nodded, understanding the weight of his son's words. "I get that. I can't expect everything to change overnight. But I'm here, Oliver. I'm not going anywhere." Oliver looked at him then, his eyes searching Richard's face. "I believe you," he said quietly. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget everything that happened before." Richard's chest tightened, the weight of regret settling in. "You don't have to forget, Oliver. I'm not asking for that. I'm just asking for a chance to be here now." To be the father you deserve. There was another long pause, and Richard could feel the years of distance between them slowly beginning to shrink, little by little. Finally, Oliver spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be here. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm willing to try. Richard felt a rush of emotion. For the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. That's all I need, Richard said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I'm here, Oliver. And I'll keep showing up, no matter what. Oliver nodded, his eyes softening as he turned to face his father. Okay, he said quietly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Richard smiled back, a sense of warmth filling him. They had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time, Richard felt like they were moving in the right direction. It wasn't going to be easy, but they would figure it out together. And that was enough. For the first time in years, Richard Bennett felt like he had something worth fighting for. He wasn't just fighting for success, for power. He was fighting for his family. And that made everything worth it. Richard sat across from Oliver, the soft glow of the kitchen light casting shadows around them. It had been a few months since their conversation in the park, and while there were still moments of hesitation, there was also a growing sense of understanding between them. The silence wasn't as heavy anymore. Oliver had started coming over more often, and their routine had slowly started to settle into something that felt almost normal. Richard glanced at his son, who was reading something on his phone, his legs stretched out on the couch. The space between them had shrunk, but there was still that quiet undercurrent, the years of lost time hanging between them. You seem quieter lately, Richard said, his voice gentle. Oliver didn't look up immediately, but after a moment, he set the phone down and met his father's gaze. Just thinking, he said quietly, his voice still guarded but less distant than before. I don't know, it's just weird, you know? Things are changing. I'm changing. Richard nodded, understanding the weight behind Oliver's words. I get it. It's a lot to process. I'm still trying to catch up with everything, too. There was a brief pause, the weight of their past still lingering, but it didn't feel as suffocating now. You're doing better, Oliver said, the words hesitant but honest. I know I haven't said much, but I've noticed. It's just still hard to believe sometimes. Richard's heart tightened, but there was a warmth there too. It was the first time Oliver had acknowledged the effort he had been putting in. It was small, but it was progress. I know I can't make everything better overnight, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. But I'm here. I've always been here, even when I wasn't. Oliver looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve. I don't need you to make everything perfect, he said quietly. I just need you to keep being here. Keep trying. Richard swallowed hard, his throat tight. I will. I promise you I will. Oliver's gaze softened, the walls between them beginning to crumble just a little more. I'm still trying to figure things out. But it's easier with you here. Richard felt a weight lift off his shoulders, something he hadn't realized he was carrying. We'll figure it out together, he said, his voice steady. One step at a time. Oliver nodded, his expression thoughtful. One step at a time, he echoed. Richard smiled, a sense of relief flooding through him. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was real. They were making progress. They were rebuilding something that had seemed lost forever. And for the first time in a long time, Richard felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. With Oliver. He wasn't going to let go again. Not now. Not ever. Richard stood at the window, the city lights flickering in the distance. The apartment, though simple, had become a sanctuary. He had spent years chasing success, but now, it was moments like these, quiet, simple moments, that felt like what he had been searching for all along. Oliver walked into the room, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket, his expression thoughtful. Richard turned to him, his heart light, but full of anticipation. You doing okay? Richard asked, trying to mask the concern in his voice. Oliver met his gaze, a small, hesitant smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Yeah, just thinking about everything, he replied. Richard nodded, understanding the weight behind his son's words. The past few months had been a whirlwind. They were still learning how to navigate this new relationship, but the bond between them was growing stronger with each passing day. I know it's not easy, Richard said gently, but I'm proud of you, Oliver. I know this isn't the life we imagined, but we're getting there. Oliver took a deep breath, his eyes drifting to the window, watching the world outside. I never really thought about what having a father meant. I thought it was just something that happened for other people, not for me. Richard's heart tightened. He had missed so much of Oliver's life, and he couldn't help but feel the sting of regret. I'm sorry, son, Richard said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I can't change the past, but I'm here now, and I'll never let you down again. Oliver didn't respond immediately, and Richard could see the gears turning in his mind. For a moment, Richard wondered if he was making any progress at all. But then, Oliver looked at him, his gaze softening, and a flicker of understanding passed between them. I know you're here now, Oliver said, his voice steady. It's just hard to trust that things will be different. It's hard to believe that it won't just fall apart again. Richard stepped closer, his eyes searching Oliver's face. I get that, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for you, and I'll keep showing up, even when it's hard. Oliver's expression softened, and he exhaled slowly. I'm still figuring it out, you know? It's not like we can just pick up where we left off. Richard nodded. I don't expect that. We'll take it one day at a time. But I promise you, I'm not going to let go of this. Not now. Not ever again. There was a long silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came when two people were finally on the same page. Oliver broke the silence, his voice quieter than before. Thanks, Dad, he said softly. The words were simple, but they carried so much weight. Richard smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. You don't have to thank me, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm just glad to be here. Oliver's lips curled into a small smile, the first real smile Richard had seen in a long time. It wasn't a perfect moment. It wasn't a magical fix to everything that had happened. But it was a start. And for the first time, Richard felt like maybe, just maybe, they were on the right path. They weren't going to fix everything overnight. But they had each other now, and that was all that mattered. He wasn't giving up on his son. Not now. Not ever. Richard sat at the dining table, looking at the empty chair across from him. The apartment felt quieter these days, but there was a comfort in the silence. Oliver was out with friends, doing things that young people did, things Richard had missed out on while chasing his career. Richard didn't mind the quiet. It felt like they were finally settling into a rhythm, one where neither of them had to rush or pretend to be something they weren't. Life had a way of teaching you things when you least expected it, and Richard had learned that the hard way. He had spent so many years building an empire, thinking that success would fix everything. But the truth was, it didn't. It couldn't. As he sat there, reflecting on the changes in his life, he felt a sense of gratitude. It wasn't just for the progress he and Oliver had made, but for the opportunity to be here at all, to make up for lost time. The road wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when Richard wondered if things would ever feel normal between them. But then there were small victories, like the way Oliver no longer flinched when Richard spoke to him, or the moments of shared laughter when they did something simple, like cooking dinner together. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't what he had envisioned. But it was real. Richard smiled to himself, the weight of his past mistakes lifting just a little. It wasn't the end of their journey, but it was a new beginning. Oliver came back later that evening, his smile brighter than it had been in months. He had been spending more time with friends lately, and Richard could see the changes in him. He wasn't the same boy who had walked into Richard's life, carrying the weight of abandonment and years of unanswered questions. Oliver had started to open up, to trust again, and that meant more than anything. Hey, Dad, Oliver said as he walked into the kitchen. Richard looked up, feeling a warmth spread through him. How was it? Richard asked. It was good, Oliver replied, his voice light. I'm glad you're here, you know. I didn't realize how much. I missed having someone to talk to. Richard felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to say so many things in that moment, but instead, he just nodded, a simple gesture to let Oliver know that he understood. I'm glad too, Richard said softly. And I'm here, whenever you need me. Oliver smiled and sat down at the table. They didn't need to say much. There was an understanding between them now, a silent bond that spoke louder than any words could. Richard knew there was still a long road ahead of them, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were on the right path. They weren't trying to fix the past anymore. They were simply building something new together. A relationship that was strong, real, and grounded in the understanding that it wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up every day, and that was enough.